Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today we're going to be discussing one of Somerset County, New Jersey's oldest unsolved homicides. It was a fall evening in the Northeast when a young girl stepped out of her house after receiving a mysterious phone call. Days would go by until she was found, but by this time her family's worst fears had become reality. Today's case is about the murder of Sharon Thor. Sharon Thor was born and raised in New Jersey. Her mother, Sonia, had immigrated to the United States from Cuba as a teen, and sometime after her arrival, met a man named Frank Thor. He was a hard worker who owned and operated a machine shop in Rahway, New Jersey. The two went on to fall in love and build a life together, eventually raising 5 children. 4 boys, Noel, Frank, Stephen, and Chris, and their one girl, Sharon, who was a tough little cookie. The people close to her knew she wasn't someone you'd want to pick a fight with. Growing up alongside her brothers, she learned to handle her own. From what I can tell, the kids had a pretty normal upbringing and they were a happy family. However, Sharon had dealt with some struggles as a young girl. Her mother told a journalist for My Central Jersey about a condition Sharon had with her feet. When she would walk, they'd point inwards, and because of this, doctors urged Sonia to have her daughter wear this sort of contraption at night to try and rectify the problem.
I remember wearing headgear for my braces as a kid. I thought that sucked, but when comparing that to having to wear something to straighten my feet, I guess that wasn't so bad.
I never went through that, but when I was reading through the article, I instantly felt connected to Sharon due to my own experience with something kind of similar. When I was a little girl, I was like pigeon-toed, I think that's what you'd call it. It wasn't terrible, but sometimes I'd trip over myself when walking or running. Thank God I grew out of that one. But enough about that. It seemed as though the night brace Sharon wore ended up helping, and as she grew older, a fondness for dancing began to sprout. Any reservations her parents may have had about the new hobby were quelled by Sharon's doctor, who told them that dancing could be good for her and may even assist in remedying her condition. So, her parents enrolled her in classes. And as soon as Sharon began dancing, everything just seemed right. She dabbled here and there in various styles, eventually landing on her favorite, ballet. She put in the work, day in and day out, honing her craft, which was put on full display during the multiple recitals she performed in throughout her childhood and preteen years. The support Sharon received from her family was immense. They were always there to cheer her on as they watched her hours of practice manifest into art. Sharon's mother told My Central Jersey, quote, "She really liked it. She was a beautiful dancer. She was serious about ballet. She was definitely serious. She always looked to do the Nutcracker shows during the holidays," end quote. It felt like Sharon was one of those lucky people, the kind that, by chance, discovered her passion early on and would have the opportunity to construct their life around it going forward. She'd even envisioned herself owning her own dance school one day. By the time she was a teenager, Sharon was already accruing some serious dance accomplishments. She'd earned herself multiple awards, 2 of which being the Royal Academy of Dancing Award for ballet, as well as the Imperial Society of Teachers of Dancing Honors Award for ballet. And by December of 1981, landed a part in the Nutcracker, just as her mother said she always wanted to. By the time October came around the following year, Sharon was about to be celebrating her sweet 16. She'd blossomed into a beautiful young woman with vibrant blue eyes, curly, voluminous hair, and a beaming smile that you couldn't help but be drawn to. She'd just begun her freshman year at Franklin Township High School and was, of course, still spending tons of her time dancing. I've seen it reported that not only was she attending the Neva McCrimmon School of Dance, but she had also started dancing for the Divine School of Dance, located in Parsippany, New Jersey. Oh, and to make this clear, it's been mentioned that Sharon would never miss a dance class. This was serious business to her. So much so that it feels like she mustn't have had much free time. Her dedication was something else.
I think free time is what you make of it, though. A lot of people that are passionate about something, whether it be a sport or a hobby, enjoy spending all the time they have on it.
Yeah, that's really true. I mean, look at how we are with this podcast now. I spend all my free time on it. Now, at this point in our story, it was October 26th, and Sharon's birthday was just 2 days away. Her mother had already wrapped and set aside her gifts, a pair of cowboy boots Sharon had been eyeing, along with a new charm, presumably for her gold chain necklace she always wore, and a framed ballet photo of her. But even with the festivities of turning 16 being so close she could likely taste it, October 26th was just another day in the life of Sharon Thor, and dance class was on the menu for that evening. That afternoon was like many before it. Sharon's father, Frank, was working all day at his machine shop alongside her mother, Sonia, who left sometime during the early afternoon, as she often did, in order to make it home before the kids. The details regarding when everyone got home from school and what took place shortly after aren't clear, but we can assume that Sharon arrived sometime around 2 to 3 p.m. with plans to attend dance class later that night around 6 p.m. She and her mother would normally head out of their John E. Bush Avenue home around 5:45 p.m., allowing approximately 15 minutes to make the 3-mile drive to the dance hall in Bound Brook, New Jersey. However, sometime around 5:30 p.m., Sharon received a phone call. It's been reported that Sharon seemed elated about this particular call and that she likely knew whoever was on the other line. And like with any teen, you can expect that she wanted her privacy. With Mom in the same room, Sharon turned away, pulling the long, coiled phone line behind her as she snuck off to speak to this mystery caller, free from any prying ears that may be interested in hearing their conversation. From what I understand, it was a quick exchange, and as soon as she hung up the phone, Sharon hurried towards the door as she hollered to her mom that she'd be right back, and proceeded to dash out of the house. Sonia presumed she'd come right back as they needed to leave in 15 minutes, so she didn't think much of it. Sonia even told My Central Jersey that she just suspected that Sharon was having a friend over. But as the minutes continued to pass with no signs of her daughter's return, Sonia began to worry, and soon enough, the clock ticked past 5:45 p.m. Sharon was still nowhere to be seen, and now it was too late for her to get to dance on time. This wasn't how Sharon acted. Something was off, and when Frank arrived home a short while later, he and Sonia needed to get to the bottom of it.
When you described how Sharon acted when she got that phone call, I immediately thought it had to be like some type of love interest. It wouldn't be the first time a young teen put off their responsibilities in pursuit of romance.
Yeah, I get that. But based on everything that's been said about her, she was super responsible. And more than anything, would never miss a dance class. And on top of that, it's discovered that when Sharon had left the house, she hadn't taken a single thing with her, running out with just the clothes on her back. A red striped sweater, her gold chain necklace, jeans, and tennis shoes. She hadn't even grabbed her purse. There was no reason to believe she wasn't coming right back to get ready for dance. Her parents wasted no time and drove to the local police station to report their daughter missing. But, of course, we can't forget how things were in the early 80s. It was common for authorities to believe that kids were just runaways and they'd return home after they cooled off. But based on what we know, that wasn't the case with Sharon. Nothing seemed wrong. She was happy when she answered the phone and didn't give any indicators that she would have left with no plan to return. It's not like she left angrily and decided to skip dance because of an argument or something. But even though the Thors knew this wasn't like their daughter, and they conveyed that to authorities, they eventually left the station receiving no assistance in finding their missing girl. Frank and Sonia, along with their 4 boys, wouldn't let that stop them from looking for Sharon themselves, though. They drove around town for hours, scouring every spot they could think of in hopes of finding her. But as the night grew darker, while having no luck during their search, the family couldn't help but think that something terrible had happened. The following morning, after a long, sleepless night spent worrying about their daughter's well-being and whereabouts, the Thors went back to the police station and were finally allowed to file a missing persons report. Even though it hadn't been a full 24 hours at this point, it appears as though authorities realized the seriousness of the situation and made an exception. It's been stated that after this report was filed, police were involved in some type of search that took place around the area Sharon went missing. But I can't tell if it was just a quick peek around the area or more of a full-fledged examination. But based on the fact that authorities uncovered absolutely nothing, it seems like it may have been more of a cursory search. However, on October 29, 1982, one day after what should have been Sharon's 16th birthday, and 3 days after she ran out of the house, several people who'd been checking a wooded area for clues just a quarter mile from the Thors' home finally located the missing girl, who'd been left partially concealed after she'd been brutally beaten to death. After 3 agonizing days without answers, the Thors were then struck with the heaviest of blows as they learned of their blue-eyed darling's murder. The brutalization that Sharon endured is unimaginable. The Central New Jersey Home News described that her, quote, head and chest were crushed. The ME declared her cause of death being blunt force trauma via injuries sustained to her head and ribs, causing internal bleeding. It was also stated that she may have been sexually assaulted, but this may have been influenced by reports from authorities stating that some of Sharon's clothes were, to some extent, removed from her body. I was unable to locate any other official confirmation of this being stated as fact, though. The autopsy findings were also able to narrow down a time of death. It was determined that Sharon had been killed around 6:30 p.m. the night she'd gone missing, which, if you remember, was only about an hour after she'd left her house. It was also reported that police had located a cinder block and a 2x4 piece of wood at the crime scene, which they believed to be the murder weapons. Authorities later released a public statement revealing this information.
Now, you said that when Sharon was found, she was partially concealed. Were you able to find out any more details about this? Like, was she left there by her killers who made no attempt to cover up what they'd done and maybe leaves had fallen from the trees and covered her? Or did someone actually make an attempt to hide her?
Most of the articles I found on her case had mentioned that it was obvious that they had attempted to hide her body, but it never goes in depth into how she was concealed.
That's rough then. If we had a bit more detail on that, then it could help decipher if whoever did this was like, oh shit, I need to get out of here because it may not have been planned, or if this was some type of calculated killing where they attempted to bury her so she'd never be found.
For sure. It doesn't really seem like it was a premeditated attack, at least based on what we know at this point. When it's just reported that whoever did this made an attempt to conceal her, that doesn't really give much to go off of.
You got that right. That could mean a number of different things. Specifics are important. But one thing to keep in mind going forward that we do know for sure is that police collected 2 murder weapons. So, the possibility of there being more than one person involved is much more likely now.
Another important detail for the investigation was the location where Sharon's body was found. It was described in the Courier News as, quote, an area maintained by a utility company about 50 feet from a dirt access road, end quote. Now, I've done some detectivizing, and I think I've nailed down exactly where the wooded area was based on an aerial view of John E. Bush Avenue, the street the Thors lived on. There really aren't any other heavily wooded areas nearby, so I'm 99% sure this is the one. I'll have a photo of what I'm talking about on our socials and our website. All details and links will be listed in the show notes. So, even when looking at this location from a newer overhead view, it seems as though this would have been a place only someone familiar to the area would visit. This same idea was shared by Sonia, who believed that the person responsible was a local, specifically because of how difficult it was to get to. The section of woods where Sharon's body had been discovered was apparently a spot frequented by local high school and college-aged individuals. The blatantly posted no trespassing sign did all but deter these youths from hanging out and partying on the property. Not only that, but hunters, dirt bikers, and ATVers were also known to pass through this location regularly.
Knowing this helps solidify the idea that whoever killed Sharon knew about this spot, and most likely because they had been there before.
Sure, they'd likely been there before, but for what reason? Could it have been a contractor working for the utility company that maintained the area? Or was it one of the many people who lived nearby that may have gone through it one time or another?
That's something we'll need to try and narrow down as we go, but just knowing that the killers had been there before is enough to start ruling out the idea of a vagrant being responsible.
Within a week of Sharon's murder, the Courier News had confirmation from authorities that they had already interviewed over 35 people in relation to the case. However, even with that many people having been talked to, it doesn't really seem like police had learned anything of immense value. While providing an explanation regarding the fact that investigators hadn't been able to establish a motive for the crime just yet, the prosecutor back in '82 Nicholas Bissell Jr. told the Courier News, quote, "There are a number of people we are looking at very strongly. We can't limit it at this point to someone she may have known," end quote. Both of these things are understandable. It had only been a week since she was found. Not all murder investigations work as quickly as Criminal Minds or Law & Order might make you believe. But anyway, as the case began to garner attention in the local news, some interesting details emerged. It's reported that after Sharon ran out of the house, she had hopped into the passenger seat of a car that was waiting for her on her street. At this point, authorities aimed to uncover more information about the car, who was driving it, and if it was seen anywhere else later on that evening after picking Sharon up. In the news articles initially released in Sharon's case, authorities used local media to ask that any witnesses who may have seen the exchange between Sharon and the occupants of the car to come forward and provide any information they could. Not only did authorities need to work towards identifying who Sharon was last seen with, but they also needed to dig deeper into this mysterious phone call she received before heading out of the house. Was someone luring her out? Did the call come from the area or somewhere else entirely? Or did it not have anything to do with the car waiting for her outside at all?
There's a lot to break down there, so let's do it piece by piece. First, to address the question that the call Sharon received had nothing to do with her getting into the parked car outside her house. Is it possible they're not related? Sure, but I don't think that's the case here. The chances of her getting the call, running outside, and voluntarily entering a car for any reason other than what was said on the phone seem extremely unlikely.
True. I don't necessarily think this is the case, but I don't know, just to throw out some other option as to why. Maybe when Sharon ran out of the house, she was planning to head to a friend's house down the street really quick or something. And then there's this car outside and they yell to her, "Hey, where you going?" And she's like, "Oh, just going to so-and-so's house." And they're like, "Hop in, we'll give you a ride." I mean, it doesn't seem likely, but you can't totally rule it out, at least not without more info.
That's about the only reason I could agree to in thinking that the call wasn't connected, but I still wouldn't bet on it. One thing that muddies the water, though, in respect to the car and the call, is that this was 1982. These aren't the times of readily available car or cell phones. So there's a very slim chance that someone in that car was the one that made the call. So who did?
You see, this was something I got really hung up on while I was researching. To me, I feel like having a car phone isn't an option. So you'd think someone nearby would have made the call, hopped in the car, and got to Sharon's street relatively quickly. However, when I was reviewing my sources, there were several that kept using the word waiting. And I just kept asking, what does this mean? Because if she ran out of the house the second she hung up the phone, how could the car have already been sitting there on her street waiting for her to come out? Unless there was some inaccurate reporting or things were misconstrued before an article went to print. Could she have gone out and she waited a few minutes for the car to roll up? I mean, either way, I think if that word waiting means something, then it's important and showed investigators that they needed to narrow down the origins of that phone call.
Exactly. It's small bits like that which help steer the ship towards the next lead. And staying on the topic of the call, the next thing that needs to be clarified is where Sharon was running off to only 15 minutes before she had to leave to get to dance class.
And that's the million-dollar question right now. As the investigation continued, Sonia felt frustrated with the lack of progress being made. Based on what I've been able to dig up, it seems as though a big part of that frustration had to do with the fact that several parents of Sharon's fellow classmates didn't feel comfortable with police questioning their children. Therefore, they declined to take part in the conversations. I'd have to think, if a minor's parent isn't consenting to any sort of communication with police, that there's not much authorities can do, especially if they don't have anything tying these kids to the crime, no?
Depending on the laws in the area during those times, likely not. Unless police had incriminating evidence on a minor, and without them or their parents cooperating, they'd have grounds to move forward with an obstruction charge. Outside of that, there's probably not a whole lot to work with there.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I get both sides of it, but of course I'd be frustrated if it were my loved one's murder police were trying to solve. Still, you can't throw people's rights to the wayside either, though. Due to the lack of concrete clues and police's inability to speak to other local teens that certainly could have known more, the case stalled out almost immediately. Over 27 years would go by with no forward movement in the case being made public, until November of 2009, when an article was published in the Star-Ledger, bringing to light information surrounding additional evidence and details authorities had gathered. It seemed as though their plea for a witness to come forward had paid off, and they were now in possession of valuable information. News of this witness wasn't the only thing laid out publicly, though, as investigators even went on to reveal at least some of what they had learned. It's reported that in the early evening hours of October 26, 1982, a child had been playing in their front yard when they saw Sharon leave her home. This witness had seen Sharon getting into the passenger seat of a car that was parked along the street. Not only did they see Sharon, as well as a quick glimpse of the other occupants inside the vehicle, but they were also able to provide detectives with some information regarding the car itself. The car that Sharon got into was occupied by two individuals, both of which were described as white males. One was reported to have had dark-colored hair, and the two men were believed to be in their late teens to early 20s. Unfortunately, the witness was very young at the time and didn't really have any sort of description of what the car itself looked like, but did remember that the exhaust system was very loud. And it's this last piece of information that was released that feels like one of the most important. Authorities stated that they were fairly certain these men were local to the area and may even be from Franklin.
I wonder if the description of the loud exhaust helped narrow down the owner of the vehicle. Maybe it had been a muscle car or a real junker with a hole in the muffler that could be easily spotted. Police must have had some inkling as to who had been involved and then used this witness's statement to support their assumption. I can't imagine they'd take what a little kid said and put it out to the public without some vetting. So, knowing that there must have been some credibility to this whole claim, if Sharon had gotten into the car with two men, I immediately think back to the two murder weapons and wonder if these were her killers. They would have been the same age as the people who were said to be hanging around that area.
Right? That was one of the first things that came to mind when I initially started looking into this case. I just felt like there had to have been two people involved. And something Sharon's mom said really brought the whole thing home. She said, quote, "That was something that I always said from day one. She'd been dancing since she was 4 years old. One person, she would have had a chance," end quote. This girl was strong. Dancing, especially ballet, is not an easy sport. It requires a certain type of physicality. And something else Sonia had mentioned before was regarding her 4 sons. Sharon was said to be able to hold her own against her brothers. So this is just another reason to believe she would have been able to fight back against one attacker, but maybe not two.
I agree with that, and I just wanted to touch on something else that stood out to me that may not to other people. This witness said Sharon got into the passenger seat of the vehicle that was occupied by 2 males.
Okay, you're definitely thinking the same way I am. I questioned that too. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, at first, you might think that the driver had been a love interest coming to pick her up, and he had told his passenger to sit in the back so Sharon could share the front seat with him. But then, if you're thinking that these guys were up to no good, then by having one person sit in the back, it'd be easier to subdue and control her.
Yes, exactly. If she was in the back and these 2 guys were up front, that doesn't really give them any leverage. You'd think if they had some messed up plan, they wouldn't want her to be able to just jump out of the car.
That's right. But regardless of all that, we need to figure out where Sharon thought they were going when she got in that car. Again, it can't be stated enough that she never missed her dance classes. So what was the plan?
That's what I just can't seem to figure out. Once it was revealed that these 2 men may now be persons of interest, another article from the Star-Ledger that was published just 1 month earlier might make you raise an eyebrow when imagining a link between the two. This article was titled, "Evidence Sought in 1982 Slaying." It described a hearing that was supposed to have taken place the week prior to this article's publishing, and this hearing was in regards to the collection of DNA from an unknown suspect. The thing is, the hearing never took place due to a mishap in scheduling, and didn't seem to have ever been rescheduled. There's a passage that describes an exchange between the journalist and the defense attorney for this unnamed defendant. It stated, quote, "The hearing was about obtaining a DNA sample and a motion to hold her client in investigative custody. She would not name her client, whom she called the defendant, but said holding someone in investigative custody does not require police to have a standard as high as probable cause," end quote. I wasn't really sure what this quote meant by investigative custody, but I think we can infer that it's likely holding someone in detention until they've been ruled out or charges can be filed. But I'm not sure if that's 100% right.
I'd say that's pretty accurate. We don't necessarily see it being used that often, most likely because the longer someone is in custody, the more liability the department holds onto. But in a case like this, where there was a serious crime committed, I understand it. Generally, if someone is being held this way, they can be detained for a number of hours, sometimes anywhere from 4 to 96 hours. Usually the deciding factors that dictate the length of time are things like the state where the crime occurred, the severity of the crime, or the flight risk of the suspect.
Yeah, that all makes perfect sense. As far as that hearing goes, though, I really don't know if it ever got rescheduled. If it did, there doesn't appear to be anything reported about it. And that leaves me wondering, could they have still obtained the DNA another way, outside of, a court order? Like, maybe they surveilled the guy to get his DNA once he threw his trash away or something?
Well, once trash is put out to the curb, it is fair game, so I guess it's a possibility. I'm just not sure what hoops investigators would have had to jump through to verify any DNA that had been collected that way.
There was one small passage that was kind of buried at the bottom of the DNA hearing article that I felt stood out. It stated, quote, "The Somerset County Prosecutor's Office started a cold case squad 7.5 years ago to re-examine 4 unsolved killings, including that of Thor, according to a 2003 story in the New Jersey Lawyer." In the Thor case, Somerset County Prosecutor Wayne Forrest was quoted then as saying, "There were things the assailant may have been grabbing hard, so we might be able to find DNA on it," end quote. Unfortunately, I was unable to locate the 2003 story referenced in that quote, but I have a feeling there's some halfway decent information in it.
I wonder if they're referring to the murder weapons. Even up to this point, those seem like some of the only valuable pieces of physical evidence they'd collected.
I would have to assume that, most likely, they are. These seem to be the only items that have been mentioned that would specifically tie someone to the crime. But unfortunately, investigators have never revealed what items they were planning to test. There have been no updates to any of the Star-Ledger articles we've mentioned so far, and it's unclear if authorities were able to obtain the DNA they were in search of. It seems as though we may never gain further insight into that unless the case is solved. As of 2009, the case had been with the Major Crime Squad of the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office, who were being assisted by the Franklin Township PD and the FBI. If the case has changed hands since then, it doesn't seem to have been stated publicly. And that's pretty much where this investigation sits. There have been no new press releases indicating any progress that's been made. I know this story probably feels like a whirlwind that's torn through, leaving behind nothing but loose ends. And when it comes to theories, sadly, there's not much there either. Based on what's been reported, it seems as though we can assume that whoever killed Sharon was local, familiar with the crime scene area, and most likely knew her personally. But that's where things go dark. We don't know who called Sharon that afternoon or what they talked about. We don't know if authorities were able to track this caller down and are just holding back with that information. We don't know who those men in the car were, what type of car they drove, or the name of the suspect that was supposed to attend that DNA hearing. Could that suspect have been in the car the day Sharon was murdered? We don't know if there were additional witnesses who came forward with valuable information that hasn't been made public. And what I believe to be one of the most important pieces to this whole thing is that we don't know where Sharon was going when she ran out of the house that night. She left with only the clothes on her back and seemingly every intention to return home with enough time to attend dance. I know I'm leaving you with a plethora of questions, but they need to be asked, and someone out there has the answers. Even though they should have been given 40 years ago, those answers can still help bring some type of closure to a suffering family. Sharon's older brother Noel stated that her death was, quote, "like the end of the world to me," end quote. She loved her brothers so much, and while they have had to deal with her unsolved murder for so many years, they still remember fond memories of her. Sharon's youngest brother, Chris, was only 11 years old when his big sis was taken from him. He stated, quote, "All I remember is she always stuck up for me, and she was always home when I got home from school," end quote. Sharon's murder took a heavy toll on the Thor family, so much so that just 2 years after she was killed, they were compelled to move out of their home on John E. Bush Avenue in Franklin, New Jersey. Sharon's father, Frank, passed away in 2007, leaving Sonia to manage the loss of another loved one. But as much pain as these tragedies caused her, she will not let them break her. Sonia told My Central Jersey in 2019, quote, "I want for the person to feel the misery I have for 37 years. So many years I've gone through hell day after day for 37 years. I promised myself I will not die until I find who killed Sharon." Please help authorities close Sharon's case, the oldest and one of only 4 unsolved homicides in Somerset County, New Jersey. There's a $5,000 reward being offered from Crime Stoppers for information leading to an arrest and indictment of the person or persons responsible for Sharon Thor's murder. If you know anything, please contact the Crime Stoppers tip line at 888-577-8477 or the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office, Major Crimes Unit at 908-231-7100. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.